days of Noah, so also shall it be in the day of the coming of the Son of Man.
This video is about one of the most controversial events in all of human history.
There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that.
Some things are going to be said which might disagree slightly with your high school textbooks.
And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God, the angels,
The Hebrew word B'nai Ha-Elohim, or in English, sons of God, at that point in the text does not mean cute little creatures with wings. It specifically means extremely ancient, very powerful, dimensional entities, exactly 0 wings. And many of your most ancient texts, like the Sumerian Epic of Gilgamesh or the pages of the Book of Enoch, depicted here, right down to the Septuagint and the precision words from the book of Genesis itself, are saying that in a strange world before that flood, like imagining an era of pure paradise, yet twisted into the deepest levels of the bizarre. The teachings and blood altars of the snake, and all of it entering in to that pre-flood world through these dimensional representatives that the Hebrew texts call B'nai Ha-Elohim, fallen angels. These sons of God, or in the pages of Enoch, the Watchers. Then, of course, plugging itself in to humanity. It's at that point in the text from all across the globe that these agents of darkness began forcefully birthing their own offspring.
that the sons of God, the angels, saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose.
One thing that seems sort of funny to me is that the people who rule the world teach their kids different things than they want taught to yours. As a touch of a side note, when you're dealing with Luciferians, little witchy people, the top of your most uppity up and exclusive secret societies and their beliefs of the teachings of the beings that entered in the land before time world that existed prior to that flood. You may hear terms like the secret doctrine, mystery religions, or my personal favorite, the age and time period of Atlantis. Shh. It's supposed to be a secret.
When the fallen watchers came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown.
I want to go a little further than just cracking open Pandora's box to peer into that pre-flood world. I definitely want us to take a critical look at the teachings of these fallen angels, the claimed mystery teachings, the mystery schools, making it perhaps full circle. The little shadow people to the deepest regions of the occult and entities washing us up finally at the mother of all harlots, the great goddess of every dark age and empire, Babylon.
But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was just a man and perfect, untampered and pure in the bloodlines of his generations, and Noah walked with God. And Noah begat 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
You know, when I hear about bloodlines, I get really interested. There's always something special about the blood. You ever notice how it's often the tiniest little bitty details that bring the most illumination? Of course, I'm hoping that surely you didn't believe that this is a story that ends with a boat. Isn't it always the end of one thing where a new thing begins?
It was in the same day that Noah, Noah's wife, as well as his 3 sons and their wives went into the ark. After every land-dwelling beast, wherein is theirs the breath of life, had been loaded into the ark, each after his kind. And as Noah and his family entered, the Lord shut the door to the great boat. It was then that the rage of the flood began.
Notice that the text says that it was God himself who shut the doors. Now, Noah was a carpenter, right? It's come to my attention that God seems to really like carpenters.
As waters increased, the ark was lifted up above the earth, and the violence of the waters prevailed, and were increased greatly upon the earth. Yet the ark rose and rode upon the face of the waters. All in whose nostrils was the breath of life, of all that was in the dry land, died.
But it's not just the secrets, the occult, and the mouth of madness. I want to dive in and go a whole lot deeper than all that. Was the boat from the most ancient records of all earth real? We're going to talk about the waters. We're definitely going to take a little peek at the volumes of the water. And some things are going to be said which are certain to make your favorite university professor highly uncomfortable, because I like doing that kind of thing. Will it float on the rockiest of violent and angry seas? Biological evidence that is literally screaming out for your attention. Sifting through the little bitty details, careful not to leave any fossil unturned. The physical evidence of a mass extinction event all across the face of the entire planet Earth. Of course, also taking a peek at these very long and interesting lifespans that coincidentally are not only recorded in bone, but recorded in pretty well all of your most ancient records. The dimensions and the million-dollar question: will all of the animals fit inside that boat?
And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart.
And at the dead center of the whirlwind, the beating heart in the middle of the storm, is one man, one name.
As it was in the days of Noah, so also shall it be in the day of the coming of the Son of Man.
Grip onto your life jackets.
Everybody, I just wanted to say real quick, I'm doing this live stream for a friend of mine, an old friend of mine. So it gets really interesting. This story, it's really you'll see.
It's going to be a bumpy ride. Welcome to Noah. This journey is about to begin.
And the Lord said, I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them.
The word science is the pursuit of knowledge itself, no matter where that the trail leads. And the greatest barrier against all wisdom, the stronghold against knowledge itself, is the single thought in one's mind that they already have it all figured out. It's often said that Noah couldn't have built the craft described in the book of Genesis, as if to actually state that no one in the ancient world could possibly build a really big boat. Because, after all, in Christopher Columbus's day, no one could have produced a ship of that size. And they would be absolutely right if we were talking about 1492. Columbus's box of single-layered timbers and rickety nails actually made it to the Americas. Is to some degree a surprise. In fact, boat building gets more impressive the further back in time that you go, like these Roman ships depicted here. Or how about Chinese super ships, like this one here, compared against Christopher Columbus's little bitty Santa Maria? Or perhaps going back just a pinch further in time, once again, Christopher Columbus's Santa Maria, and up here, Noah's Ark, scaled against an ancient Greek fighting ship designed to survive the rockiest of wild and raging seas. And beyond even that, at least attempt to withstand blows from catapults. It's almost as if the further back in time one goes, the more we find giant structures and building projects that baffle and amaze rooms full of modern engineers, like the pyramid, not the camel. And we can be fairly certain that the pyramids, the Sphinx's head, seen right back there, were built by highly technical and engineering-minded people. And since we can see how the stones were cut right out of the quarries, like this enormous broken obelisk right here with all the people walking on it, we can be, at bare minimum, fairly certain that the pyramids were not built by aliens, because they would have had to have been aliens with rock hammers next to their laser guns. One could almost think that the precision, knowledge required to take on these massive building projects seen all throughout the ancient world, seeming to begin these two places here, Egypt and Samaria, dropping right down from the glacier encased mountain of Ararat, the very mountain range, the very spot where the boat that saved all mankind is said to have landed. Sort of like the desire to build things that baffle and amaze us, coming down through the generations to a single parent source, as if engineering itself was in the very blood pumping through their veins. I have this strange feeling that though there are 3 sons, I think we're going to find some interesting things coming from these 2 bloodlines here, Shem and Ham. Come to think of it, one would actually expect to find enormous building projects coming right on through the generations and bloodlines of such a family as this. The model that I have personally come to favor most for the boat's actual architecture comes from the men and women over at Answers in Genesis, who simply went with ancient boat building architecture. You have many layers of offset planks comprising the walls of the framework. The pegs, of course, expand when the boat hits water, making it more watertight than any nail. Interlocking, interwoven layers, even loaded down with weights, much more than what the animals ever would have been. There is no practical argument that that boat won't float. Naval and marine engineers literally marvel at the precise measurements, dimensions, and ratios given for that boat in the book of Genesis. The same type of ratios one would use for a supertanker, technically defined as the most optimized ratios for exactly the job this boat would have had to do. Well, I mean, shouldn't come as terribly surprising that God knew what he was doing. Look at the boat in comparison to the size of what would actually be skyscraper size waves and troughs coming at it. You would have to rip the roof off of that boat to sink it. I guess the next question that might come to mind, how big were the waves? Really? And of course, can all the little animals survive? Perhaps even comfortably. Don't worry. I have this strange feeling that no matter how rocky this boat ride gets, it's going to come out just fine. On this journey to understand the truth behind the enormous boat, the vessel that saved all mankind according to the most ancient records of all earth, we definitely do not start with a boat or the razor fine details and leftovers of a global flood, nor do we begin at the base of the oldest and largest ziggurat in the world, ancient Eridu, the little dimensional gateway for the Enki, the very spot where the great god Nothing is recorded in stone to have entered. Nor do we start with the heights of spreading biological strangeness and blood altars, often for little human babies, to feed the old serpent who seems to go by so many names, or the ages of occult empires which would rise shortly following the flood, as if dancing to the musical notes and tune of a less than noble Pied Piper, almost as if there were some type of an unseen agent a dimensional puppet master whispering from behind the scenes of empires. You know, it's funny. Names and languages can change, but the symbols seem to stay the same. And you can follow those symbols all the way to the start of the Brave New World. The same starting place, coincidentally, where your first records of biological anomalies begin to appear. When peering through the looking glass, it's always an eerie feeling to find out that there's already something looking back through at you. In this modern age, I often hear people state that the supernatural isn't real, that the occult isn't real, and that what you can see with your eyes is all that there is. I strongly disagree with all of that. In fact, I could probably make a very strong case that many, if not all of those things, are actually more real than you are. Of course, that depends on what you mean by real. Was Jewish Nobel Prize winner Niels Bohr, who very famously gave us the actual model for the atom, who stated, and I quote, "Everything we call real is made of things that cannot be regarded as real." Going a step deeper, in this particular case, understand the whole picture, it may be wise for us to zoom out for just a second. You know, when looking at the stars in the heavens above, one could easily glance and say, wow, it's enormous out there. Whilst another might look and say, in a finite space, it almost appears as a little bitty fishbowl where perhaps one could hop to a much larger place. Or, wait a second, how about a cradle? And a cradle, by very definition, is not just a place where infants are born to learn, but also to begin. One has to understand that the picture here is somewhat larger than can enough boards be banged together to make a real big boat. Those pages are saying that it was God himself that told Noah to build that ship. Wasn't it Albert Einstein who wrote, "Those of us who believe in physics understand that time, space, and matter are nothing more than a stubbornly persistent illusion." If you were to really look at reality the way that it isn't comprised of matter, but of little tiny dots, statistical probabilities appearing wherever they need to appear next. A literal continuum, a majesty of mathematical wizardry, like a symphony of equations spilling from the source, an intelligent mind much larger in scope than the tiny, feeble understandings and short grasp of the 5 little bitty senses of mortal men, is all made of little tiny particle pixels, creating every tiny piece of the material world itself. Now, bear in mind, there are only 2 distinct possibilities. Either the picture is much, much larger, and you are indeed living in an intelligent construct that is continuously fed by a source. Just as the most basic of observations, from the little tiniest of cells to the stars in the heavens above, suggest, or option B, in the beginning, there was nothing, and from pure randomness and accident after accident after accident, chaos slowly rose up to become precision order, which would, of course, be the diametric opposite of every single thing that we can observe, look at, or measure in the entire place. One can only wonder what the inspirational source behind an idea like that might be. It is further said that it was nothing that exploded and became sheer precision everything, leaving you on a random rock spiraling at 66,000 miles per hour through the universe with nobody at the wheel. The answers are either much, much, much smaller in scope, as the textbooks suggest, or they're larger in scope than a human mind could begin to imagine. What the pages of Genesis, as well as the entire Bible itself, are specifically and redundantly stating is that you and I are living in a smaller subset of a much larger and far more complex reality. The wonderland of finely tuned physics, non-random particle pixels, which all have to be strangely just right. The whole limited 3-dimensional base construct of this thing that commonly goes by the name the material world, framework and fabric of this present illusion. And according to the text, is that before the rage of the waters of that flood began, what once had been beautiful, fresh, new, lush, and mesmerizing had a dark shadow fall down upon it, going from the gardens of Eden to the dark layers. Though likely extremely sophisticated, a world flipped upside down, twisted, evil, brutal, and of course, most especially, altering the natural state of things. This is recorded to have churned everything, dark and ugly, not beautiful. You know what I find absolutely fascinating? A seemingly tiny single cell, each and every single one more complex than every single NASA space shuttle and every automated car factory combined. And to run each and every little tiny cell, you are definitely going to need the software, the digital coding for life itself. Exactly 0 junk code. When you're looking at DNA, you might as well be holding the creator's signature right in the palm of your hand. Then you simply need your complete program blueprint files, opening up just like a zip file containing the complete body plans, putting together every cell, every organ, every little tiny piece and part, all coming together to create complete biological masterpiece from scratch. Neuron networking and unbelievable electrical circuitry running right down the spine to give you total and absolute control, along with all of the apparatuses of the whole spacesuit, even and especially when you're not thinking about it. And then consciously plugged in as if by Wi-Fi. You are the ghost in the machine. Noah's focus in building that boat was on what the Lord had asked him to do. The placement of every single board was much more than building a boat. While the whole world laughed and mocked about him, through Noah's eyes, they were already dead. But a faith that it was a foundation, a hope and prayer that it would lift him above the deep darkness of the Abzu, that it would save his life. Every little peg was an investment on the other side of the abyss. Every single joint that would slide into place, another piece of his heart, a payment forward towards a world he had not seen yet. Your world. All of the mouths that had laughed and mocked were swallowed in their final home, the abyss. Indeed, narrow was the door, and few were those who found it. The gate to destruction was not only wide, but was pretty well everywhere else. One could almost think that there was a deeper message embedded right in there. I couldn't find it more appropriate than to truly enter in, than with the words of the father of quantum physics itself, Max Planck, who said, and I quote, "All matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force which brings the particle of an atom to vibration and holds this most minute of solar system of the atom together. We must assume that behind this force is the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix of all matter." Diving in to ancient Egypt, beyond the first pyramid of Djoser, arriving at the first dynasty of all Egypt, Dynasty 0, and the first king, Narmer, On the front, you can see the first king of all Egypt next to his tiny sandal bearer, seeming to hold a mace in one hand with which he is about to smite an opponent that is about equally his size in the depiction. On the flip side of the oldest document from the oldest king, we see the king depicted here. The king drawn here, drawn much, much larger than the other subjects in the imagery. It was Sir Flinders Petrie, probably bar none, the most respected and renowned archaeologist in all of Egyptology, who stated in 1897, "A new race has been found. These strange remains are found over more than 100 miles of country, from Abydos to Gebelin." The race was very tall and powerful, with strong features, a hooked nose, long pointing beard, and brown wavy hair. They are shown by their carvings and bodily remains. Skeletons like this actual skeleton here from Ireland being compared against a modern size skeleton, or perhaps the entire pack of giants from Lovelock Cave, the skulls of which are seen here. One of them in this image here being compared against a modern size human skull. And it's not just hundreds of news articles like this one recording a find of a human skeleton 11 feet tall, or ones like this one from the New York Times recording a skeleton of 12 foot in height, and certainly indications of sizes that may have been even larger than that, like this depiction on a papyrus from the British Museum. And accordingly, it was the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln himself, who stated, "The eyes of that species of extinct giant whose bones fill the mounds of America have gazed on Niagara just as ours do now." Abraham Lincoln, 1848. Some of the old articles about giants, even including photos, was the noted attorney and advocate for American Indian Affairs, Vine Deloria, who wrote in his book Holocaust of the Giants, The Great Smithsonian Cover-Up. Some of these old county and regional history books contain real gems because the people were not subjected to a rigid indoctrination about the theory of evolution and were simply astonished about what they found and honestly reported it. Going a little deeper, what's also extremely curious in particularly ancient Egyptian depictions is that all of the color spectrums are already recorded. In fact, in very distinct, sharp contrasts: black, white, and a reddish brown. It would be very difficult to find a geneticist in this day and age who would not state, or at bare minimum concede, that all of the genetics for all of the races extend back to a single source. So in truth, we're all actually one enormous family. And speaking of extremely strong genetic traits and characteristics, the further back in time that you go, the much stronger that you see your genetics get. I often hear it said that World populations have been on this planet for 100,000 years, sometimes much, much, much larger than that. What I find particularly fascinating is that from a very basic mathematical perspective, if I start with two people at an exponential increase rate of 2%, just like today's rate, how long do you think it takes for me to get to 6 billion people on the planet Earth? The answer would be that at current increase rates, you would hit 6 billion people in 1,100 years. But of course, the increase rate hasn't been 2%. It's been a lot lower than 2%. The growth rate is exponential. In fact, getting littler and littler and littler the further back in rewound time that you go. One would literally predict 6 billion people on the planet Earth if you were to calculate in the expansions into new areas, the increases in food production abilities, and the slow spreading and conquering of the entire globe, for which we have full records, no less. Now, on the flip side of that coin, if I were to go with some of our more modern theories in their lowest of lowball numbers, going with just 100,000 years of growth. In 100,000 years, you would have cycled right through 6 billion people on this planet, millions and millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of times. Well, I guess my question would be this. If history truly goes back 100,000 years or more, then where are all the bodies? The math for this is easy enough that it could be done on a napkin. One would not only anticipate, but predict that you would reach a population of 6 billion in roughly 5,000 years, give or take. Maybe the theoretical guys are just all out of napkins. So in our journey across the dark hours of the Egyptian New, the watery abyss, with the very real understanding that there are at least 277 global flood accounts. Many will argue that that number of global flood accounts, many of which include pre-flood world accounts, reaches as high as 2,000. Records that literally begin to come down and then fan outwards from cultures stretching every conceivable part of the whole planet Earth. Bear in mind, these are cultures that in many cases are entirely disconnected from one another. Some of these records taking you face to face, bringing you right up to the front doorstep of that flood. And a very small handful of these, like the Eridu Genesis account shown right on the screen right here, coming so close to the actual event that the guy riding on the rock can nearly taste the water on his lips. Flood accounts such as the Toltec Indians of ancient Mexico believed that there had been a global flood that a few people had survived in a chest-shaped boat. And these pyramids in the Americas are not just eerily reminiscent of what you see an ocean away, right down in here in ancient Egypt, but also in terms of practices and beliefs. In the land of Canaan, right here, that would ultimately become Israel. Like someone had boated their way from the lands of Canaan, which were like a minefield of strange things, ultimately laid out all across the promised land that the Israelites would have to conquer. In 1 Samuel 15, it states, "Go and strike the Amalekites," a word which means vampire-like demon, a tribe located right down in here. Strike the Amalekites, the sons, the bloodline of Amalek, and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman and infant and ox and sheep and camel and donkey. Almost as if someone larger than the construct of this place wanted whatever had genetically spread into this area, all up in here, completely cleansed out. Land of the Philistine and Canaanite god Baal, who wanted the mothers to come lay down the lives of their little bitty babies on altars of blood before the horned god. Not just the giant Canaanites, sons of Ham, but also Philistine practices which seem to go right across to the Americas, where we find not only lots of large lizards, but rising pyramids with leadership that so often seem to be, whether in statue or in large-eyed stone, nearly hard to believe what you're actually looking at is real in appearance. But pulling up out of the hot spots on the coastlines of South America into Mexico, these Toltec Indians also believed that the world had, interestingly enough, begun 1716 years before that flood, and that after the mad rage of the waters, they built a great tower. Going back just a pinch further in Chinese history, which began with the founder of China, Yu, the Jia dynasty, the first dynasty of ancient China, its inception at roughly 2000 BC. This symbol right here means a vessel with 8 persons or mouths on it. We find the records, the legend of Nua and Fushi, who survived the global flood. And this legend takes us 1,000 years before the start of ancient China. The Chinese put a date to that global flood of 2952 BC, which is fascinating because if you're using the Septuagint, which is a copy of the Old Testament 1,500 years older than the King James Bible, you're going to come up with a flood date of somewhere between 3,500 and 3,000 BC, depending on how you do your mathematics, which can be trickier than one might think. Hopping backwards another step further in time towards that flood to ancient Egypt, where their first little pyramid stack of rocks would rise in Egypt in 2600 BC, where we find the gods traversing over the deep depths of the blue Abzu, the abyss, to the other side of the destruction of all earth by the waters, to the Egyptian Great Flood account, where you see here an image of the god lifting up the boat that crossed the waters of the abyss. The Egyptian Nu. And upon this boat that is being lifted up above the waters, we see the symbol of the scarab, which means rebirth and re-emergence. Now, bear in mind that the symbolism of the word waters has a dual meaning in ancient texts. Waters, or the Egyptian Nu, can mean the places of the deep, the underworld, the realm of chaos, the Abzu, or the abyss, the place where the old goat, ramming forward, the king, sits in the dimension below on his throne, the king of demons, prince of the air and owner of the serpents, the one who is said to have ruled using the body of Osiris himself as his conduit. Now, if I were to hop over from the city of Kish or Cush, the remains of which are shown right on the screen here, the settlement of which is recorded as having been founded by Noah's grandson, Cush, son of Ham, where Sargon the Great, seen here, one of his sons or grandsons, princes, shown here holding the sacred goat. It is a bad thing when the people go goat. Sargon, of course, the king who ruled ancient Samaria from Kish or Cush, named after Noah's grandson, maker of this stone here, commemorating the Tower of Babel, and Nimrod, an artifact found in Susa, Iran, or the land of Cush, right here at the tippy end of the Fertile Crescent. And going from those pyramids over to the pyramids of South America and areas around the Nazca lines, we find the controversial Ica stones depicting people with dinosaurs. Those stones, like this one being examined here with a T-Rex on it, are argued primarily by those who are in favor of Darwinism to be fakes. You would have an extremely difficult time convincing me of that, because the handful of scratchy drill bit made fakes passed off to tourists are easily, even eyeball distinguishable from authentic stones under close examination. First of all, though there are many collections coming from burial sites all over the place, the largest is the Cabrera collection of 11,000 burial stones, a third of which contain dinosaurs. These stones, if authentic, the actual engraving portion of the stone will be covered with a fine patina or biofilm. And going deeper than just Spanish explorers sending some of the stones back to Spain in 1562, artistic elements of the stones, such as the skin texture, which wasn't known by paleontologists until much after these collections were housed, are eerily accurate. Look at the size of the neck on this Mamenchisaurus. Slipping back over to ancient Egypt, to the very front of the Narmer palette, which goes with these animals here that have got the intertwined serpentine necks. Very close in appearance to possibly an Apatosaurus. And some of the depictions are extremely in your face, straightforward, like this particular artifact here. The man's hand coming up to possibly pet the dinosaur dragon. His wife standing on this side, probably getting onto him about it. Or the amazing carvings seen in the biblical city of Uruk, compared here against the skeletal structure of a Brontosaurus. Others have suggested that this imagery may be something like the Tanystropheus, very long-necked creature, about 20 feet long, seen depicted here. Zooming in just a little on the Narmer palette, I'd like you to notice that the long-necked creatures depicted have handlers holding on to them. I find this worthy of note because if I hop back over to South America, not only find the pyramid temple practice of human sacrifice and the cutting out of the heart, but also if I look over here, we find again that the dinosaur creature has a handler on it. And you have two human beings in this image that appear to be being torn apart or fed to, possibly given a weapon and forced to do battle with the reptiles. If you take a deep look at the dermal spines seen right here on this boulder-sized rock, these are spines that paleontologists didn't even know existed on these animals until 1991. Creatures like this one, which are discovered, the Amargasaurus, with the spines seen in this museum, seeming to exist in at least these areas here where enormous pyramid temples are, and also where the stones containing the depictions are found. Look how fantastically accurate this dinosaur was drawn. This is different angles from a burial vase found in South America, or meticulously detailed stonework from ancient France. Of course, here's the legendary St. George and little dinosaur dragon down here. The question really becomes, where weren't they drawing dinosaurs in the ancient world? Here's a bunch of guys on rock art. Looks like they've got themselves a Brontosaurus surrounded that perhaps they hope to have for dinner tonight. Streams of little dinosaurs on ancient burial cloth fabrics like this one here. To be honest with you, the only thing that I haven't found yet are ancient dinosaur t-shirts. And of course, the word dinosaur did not actually exist until 1841. The word would have been dragons, meaning terrible lizard. The same creatures described in detail by Marco Polo, Alexander the Great, Herodotus, often called the father of all history. One can only wonder how a creature of that size gets underneath the ground. And accordingly, we find soft tissue in these enormous animals, such as the Triceratops, hollow, transparent, and flexible blood vessels. The presence of soft vessels is enigmatic. That's a key word for it most definitely should not be there if the animal were even tens of thousands of years old, much less making claims of millions. Very difficult to swallow when you find actual gooey, fresh and soft dinosaur soft tissue like this extremely juicy looking bloody T-Rex tissue seen on the screen right here. Or one might prefer little bitty baby dinosaurs like these actual soft tissue young dinosaur embryos. Or how about this mysteriously fresh zoomed in on tissue? That's hadrosaur blood right there passing through that vein. And here's an entire and complete hadrosaur with plenty of soft tissue. Though it can make the heart sink just a little bit to learn that government, secular sciences, and those in support of the beliefs of Darwinism currently refuse at any price to test soft tissue found now all across the globe from these animals. There are those such as Dr. Don Patton, who did some of the investigations on Malachite Man, the first of a number of skeletons, was found in the same strata as dinosaurs, as well as research out in Glen Rose, Texas, where you have the longest sets, and certainly not the only sets, of human footprints that are present with dinosaur footprints, more of which appear the more ground you excavate up, by the way. Dr. Don Patton, as well as teams of other doctors in the United States, have tested more than 100 unfossilized pieces of dinosaur bone. I bet you'll never guess how many of them test teeming with carbon-14, i.e. young. All of them. Now, though we find fossils of smaller dinosaurs, I'd like you to notice that the dinosaurs depicted in the drawings, like this creature here that this guy's riding on top of, are much smaller in scale from some of the creatures that we're finding in the fossil record, like this Brachiosaurus right here in comparison to the people underneath. Here's a man and here's a Brachiosaurus. This animal has nostrils the size of a modern horse. What that means is that it couldn't even breathe today. This animal requires not only a different atmosphere, but an entirely different ecological system to survive at all. which of course brings up the important question that if your atmosphere and ecological systems are Brontosaurus in size different in the past, then let me ask you this, Doctor. And do you think that might pump out Brontosaurus size results that skyrocket on your dating tests? Not only do our living fossils, of which there are wealths, look identical in the fossil record as they do right now today, but one little bitty catch. For example, horsetail plants like this one on the screen here aren't just identical in the ancient past, but are believed to have grown to roughly 100 feet in height. This is a modern horsetail trunk. This is an ancient horsetail trunk. Here's your modern dragonfly. Here's your ancient dragonfly. This thing couldn't breathe today or lift up off the ground and fly either. Did you know that creatures like lizards, or dragonflies for that matter, actually start off little bitty, just like a regular lizard or creature today, and based upon the individual design of their genetic software will actually grow to be whatever size that the environment they are born into allows for. Many, of course, requiring much longer lifespans. It's really almost like a de-evolution, isn't it? Things going from bigger and better and tougher to smaller and lesser and weaker. This right here is an armadillo from the ancient world that is roughly the size of a small car. This is the fossil of an ant. It's about the size of a modern day hummingbird. This is an ancient crocodile called a super croc, which could just about fit a modern crocodile right in its mouth. This is a modern bald eagle's head. This above it is an ancient bald eagle's head. This is a 3-foot long rodent. This is a giant fossilized cockroach. This can get up to 18 inches. Give a very special thanks to Noah for not letting a pair of these get on the boat. This is a 14-foot long turtle. This is a giant ground sloth. Rhinoceros bones, which are 17 feet tall. This is a modern beaver's head. This is a pre-flood ancient beaver's head. And it's not just that many times when you're dealing with mammal fossils like this horse seen on the screen right here, they're surrounded by marine life, in this case fish. It was Dr. Willard Libby, not only a Nobel Prize winner, but also worked on the Manhattan Project, who invented carbon dating, who stated, and I quote, "You read books and find statements that such and such a society or archaeological site is claimed to be 20,000 years old. We learned rather abruptly that these numbers, these ancient ages, are not known, speculations and imaginative guesses. In fact, it is about the time of the first dynasty in ancient Egypt that the last or earliest historical date of any real certainty has been established." One can only wonder what Willard Libby would think think about the large numbers they toss around now. I believe it was Dr. Robert Lee who stated, "Why do geologists and archaeologists still spend their scarce money on costly radiocarbon determinations? They do so because occasional dates appear to be useful, while the methods cannot be counted on to give good, unequivocal results. The numbers do impress people and save them the trouble of thinking excessively. Absolute," in quote, "dates determined by a laboratory carry a lot of weight and are extremely helpful in bolstering weak arguments." This is a frozen baby mammoth named Dima, and this is a very, very extremely common example when it comes to radiocarbon dating. One part of the creature tested 26,000 years old, another part 40,000 years old of the same creature, and the wood next to it 9,000 years old. One might say, what about the testing methods that give really large dates like uranium or potassium argon, which is what all these tests were done on? Every one of these sites from recent history, which were dated using potassium argon. This one giving dates 200,000 plus for a site roughly 1000 AD. This one giving dates of 275,000 years. This one from the 1800s in Hawaii, 22 million years. Mount Etna, this one dated anywhere between 140,000 and 350,000 years. You could literally go through entire lists of these, being hundreds of thousands of years to millions of years off, like Mount St. Helens, an eruption that occurred in 1980, which dates at a whopping 500,000 to 2.8 million with an M years old. Another curious little factoid, on this side you've got the Grand Canyon, which some claim was formed over millions of years by this little tiny river down here. On this side, you've got what commonly goes by the name the Mini Grand Canyon, which was formed in 30 minutes. Identical, just smaller in scope to the larger version, this canyon was formed by glacier ice that melted during the eruption of Mount St. Helens. It's funny to me how catastrophic events can change the landscape of everything. Dr. Lee continues, no matter how useful radiocarbon dating it is, the radiocarbon method is still not capable of yielding accurate and reliable results. There are gross discrepancies. The chronology is uneven and relative, and the accepted dates are actually selected dates. This whole blessed thing is nothing more than 13th century alchemy, and it all depends upon which funny paper you read. And if we're just reaching in to find a date that suits us and then stick it on an artifact, it's difficult to actually call that science. Let me ask you this. If you needed a date, an actual date, a real date for something, would you use any one of these tests? Now, on the flip side of that coin, though tests like C14 or radiocarbon dating may kick out dates all over the board in one single chunk of coal, What they do demonstrate is that there shouldn't be any C14 at all if in fact they were millions of years old, as is commonly claimed for coal deposits. Coal is literally formed by massive forestry, which has somehow been covered up and swallowed by ground. Coal can be formed in a lab with heat and pressure in a little under 2 weeks. Large volumes of trees and logs and biological material that has been crushed, squeezed, and compressed underneath the earth. Likewise, oil deposits seen here, surrounded by underground running water as the earth is porous, are teeming rich with carbon-14. The oil underneath the earth is massive collections of biological material turned into squish. And oil can be produced using heat and pressure in a lab in minutes. The forests of ancient Earth, jungles squished underground. Oil deposits are not just dead dinosaurs. These are entire ecological systems swallowed by earth and stone. Every single coal deposit on Earth tests young, and every single oil and natural gas deposit on Earth tests young. And it's not just that there are seashells, clams, and massive marine life on every single mountain range on the whole planet Earth, like these shells found in the Himalayas on top of Mount Everest, where there are so many seashells that the locals sell them. And it's also not just that there are mass whale graveyards in deserts, like the Atacama Desert, the most arid desert in the world, where there are at least 80 beached whales that have been found thus far in the middle of the desert. Or perhaps in the Sahara Desert, the largest desert in the world, where we find more researchers excavating whales that dot the desert. Or perhaps one may want to hop over to the sands of ancient Egypt, where you can actually take a tour through the Valley of the Whales and look at enormous beached sea creatures like this giant whale in the middle of the desert right here. But it's not just whales that are pulled out of deserts. These researchers are excavating for penguins. And here's the fun part. The penguins found in those deserts get up to 5 feet tall. Here's a modern penguin. This is an ancient penguin. A modern cowhead, an ancient goatish cowhead, underneath which stares curiously Louis Leakey, one of the promoters of the claimed missing link, Lucy. It's often said that one would be foolish to not believe in Darwin's 1859 theory of evolution. What's strange is that there has never actually been more shadiness for any single science or all of the sciences combined than there has been for that single segment of claimed science. These embryos shown on the screen behind me were found to be fraud in 1874. Haeckel's fraud embryo drawings were meant to make human development look like animal development. These embryos are still used very often in children's textbooks, no less. right now today. Ernest Haeckel, the maker of the fraud embryo drawings, stated that other than his fraud drawings, that the fossil record was the best evidence for evolution, which is actually kind of funny to me because Charles Darwin himself stated that transitional fossils morphing from one kind of creature to become another, more specifically the lack of transitional fossils, were perhaps the most obvious and serious objection which could be urged against his theory. Just like from a genetic perspective, the animals can have different varieties and variations within the body plans of their specific genomes, not seeming to morph into one another. Same thing with the fossil record, that these animals are not seeming to slowly or gradually become one another. On this particular evolution chart, sort of similar to the embryo drawings, and there are many of these that you can take your pick from out there. We see sort of a doggish type creature that is crawling forth out of the water. Up here you see the dog was sort of amphibious, maybe kind of duck-like feet that is slowly going to become a modern dog, is the idea. Or lineups like this one, where what we're actually doing is we're taking, in this case, I got a whale at the bottom, and I'm taking independent animals that go from smaller to greater, starting with a rodent, to illustrate some kind of developmental process. You could do this with any series of bones, by the way, where we're taking small bones of one type of animal and then larger bones of a completely and clearly different type of animal, and putting them side by side with no transitions between the creatures. You could do this with anything, smaller to larger. And then as my proof for the transitions, I come up with sort of awkward drawings like these to show progressions for which there are no bones, but I've got the animal in these kind of strange stages to get me from one animal I've got bones for to the larger animal that I've got actual bones for. But from a genetic perspective, the dogs would have speciate, beginning with an original pair. This is trackable, by the way. And then you're going to get your different kinds of dogs that will stem out from the original genetic software inherent to the pair of animals, believed in the case of dogs to be trackable back to probably something like a gray wolf. The genetic software in these creatures, just like any type of software, only times every piece of software ever created by mankind times 100 trillion, and you're probably beginning to get close. This software inherent in these creatures has lots of different variables of creatures that it can produce, just like in Mendel's laws of genetics, which are used for animal breeders. However, there are limitations. Every software program on this screen may have lots of variables such as background color, etc. In the case of animals, you can have small cats, large cats, or the case of dogs, you can have bald dogs, hairy dogs, spotted dogs, furry dogs, tiny dogs, giant dogs. Or same thing with horses, but yet the cats remain cats, the dogs remain dogs, and the horses remain horses, etc., etc., etc. The program has exactly the coding that it requires, just like any living creature, to open and become whatever the program is. In layman's terms, the programming present in cats or dogs or horses or any other type, kind, or genre of creature can have lots of different variables within that kind of creature that it produces, but the genetic coding inherent in cats does not have the information to produce whales, just as the information in dogs does not have the coding to either come from or become fish. Following suit with that, the evolution would have to apply to all of the plant life on this planet as well, leading one perhaps to ask how many apple seeds would have to be planted before one started growing bananas. Now, if one were going to find evolution, where it would have to actually lie is within this precision, tit for tat, line for line, genetic coding. You need a source for the digital information, which is going to make creatures mutate into each other, going from littler, like you see in the drawings, to bigger and bigger, which is strangely the opposite of what we find in the fossil record. Nonetheless, you would need a source for that digital coding, commonly suggested to be mutations, error code or junk code, introduced into the genetic coding, making the animals morph better and better over time. So let me ask you, the viewer, if I have a computer program that precisely builds and opens to become something, and I begin adding random junk code and mutation code. So if I were to begin to add junk code, random lines of mutation code and error code to any one of the different kinds of programs running software, which have lots of variables within each one of these on my computer screen, if I added junk code to one of these programs, would it evolve to become a better program than it is, or would the program fall apart? Bottom line, the genomes, the genetic programming, the packets for these animals have coding that has all sorts of little variables producing different speciated varieties, which happens exponentially and rapidly, just like population growth, by the way. Yet they're still fundamentally the same type of animal. Taking that a step further, it's this very speciation that plays a role in the numbers of originating pairs of animals that we need for our boat ride. What's also interesting as a side note about animals, just like the mystery of consciousness within humans, is that animals are often the indicator of a storm or an issue coming to an area. Accordingly, within the Genesis text is that God is telling Noah, for example, to only take 2 of each kind, male and his female, as if to specifically indicate that as the time becomes right, these animals will be showing up in mass, not 2 by 2. And not only do we only need our land mammals, reptiles, and birds, as most all of the life on this planet, the bulk of it, is marine life, amphibians, planktons, algae, plants. So we only need a tiny fraction, the actual animals that exist on this planet. But interestingly, more than that, creatures like cute little bitty bears, obviously they hibernate and also recycle the waste within their bodies for long periods of time during that hibernation. But it begins to become absolutely amazing when you begin picking through the little pairs of animals and finding that each and every every one of them actually has specific traits and survival instincts that almost make them perfectly conducive for this boat ride. And not only are most all of the animals on this planet little tiny anyway, I'm sure with the larger creatures, Noah was smart enough to bring the young ones. Then, of course, all of these animals genetically speciate, some of them into hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different types or species of animals coming from an originating pair, making the actual question that most people fear the most about Noah's Ark actually really boiled down to a shipping issue. Got a boat comprised of 3 decks, which is roughly the height of a 5-story tall building. This particular ship, at its most modest measurements, is longer than a football field by a lot. Though there are many different measurements for a cubit, which is the unit of measurement used in the text of Genesis for Noah's Ark, the most likely and reasonable numbers that you're going to have for the inside of this boat, stretching all the way to the back there, are going to be about 87 feet wide, about 525 feet all the way to the back of the boat back there, and roughly 52 feet in height. In layman's terms, the most probable size of that vessel is roughly the equivalent of a 750 rail car super tanker. Now, what that's going to equate to, if I go with animals that are roughly the size of a full-size sheep, which most of these animals are nowhere near the size of a full-size sheep. Nonetheless, this boat would hold 180,000 full-size sheep. Now, going with the high numbers on how many animals that I actually need on this boat to get all of the creatures and species that we have today, the high numbers for that would be 17,550 pairs of animals, or in layman's terms, 35,000 animals on that boat. Just for the fun of it, let's double that 35,000 number. On top of that, let's add another 5,000 animals for the clean animals specified in the biblical text. That's going to bring us to a grand total of 75,000 animals inside that boat, or roughly 42% of the space of our ancient super tanker. But if we go with more realistic numbers on the pairs of animals that we're going to need, including all of the dinosaurs and their kinds, by the way, would actually be in totality something more like 21,000 animals in total. In layman's terms, that's roughly 12% of this enormous boat. Yes, indeed. From a shipping perspective, a genetic and speciation perspective, as well as a bottom line mathematical perspective, going with the highest possible numbers on your species counts, yes, this boat will do the job. Switching gears to the monkeys to men missing link claims within evolution, it was the famous fraud Piltdown Man, which actually got evolution taught within the public schools. This was a fraud that lasted roughly 40 years until just about everyone involved with it was dead. Imagine researchers' surprise when they finally had the opportunity to actually investigate the claimed one and only missing link that had the head of a human skeleton and tacked on the bottom the jawbone of an orangutan. You could actually go through entire lists of these that turned out to be hoaxes. The current claimed missing link for evolution is
Hope
called
you are
Lucy.
enjoying this.
Original claims about Lucy were that if it had little feet, that they'd be little human feet. If it had hands, notice it's missing all these parts, it'd be little humanish hands. That if it had a complete skull, that we could tell that it was a humanish skull. And finally, that the pelvis bone, if it was complete and not broken, would show that this small monkey walked upright, which wouldn't matter even if it did, because you have monkeys today that walk upright. Nonetheless, we found many Lucy's at this point with their little hands, their little feet, their little heads, and their little pelvises. And this is how Lucy is commonly depicted at museum exhibits. Sort of looks a little like a mud-covered swamp thing coming forth from a late-night science flick, emerging forth to scare the kids as they walk through, doesn't it? Nonetheless, if we were to do a more realistic and critical recreation of the small African monkey Lucy, or technically an ape, using modern knowledge, and more specifically modern knowledge of the bone structures of these cute little creatures right here. If I follow the very long arms down to the little monkey hands, the little ape hands, they're knuckle walkers. They walk on their little knuckles to get around. Accordingly, the hip bones are actually designed for that knuckle walking. And coming down the little leggy on this cute little creature right here, Lucy is commonly depicted in museum displays as having human feet. That actually turns out to be just a pinch important. But nonetheless, the feet on apes or chimpanzees or monkeys, these creatures basically have 4 sets of hands, which allows the little ape or little monkey, take your pick, to run around in the forest and in the trees and to grip onto stuff and swing back and forth. Actually, the little feet down there turn out to be a rather large, shall we say, problem in the evolution storyline. I'll let you dig into that if you like. In short, what we found here is the absolute and total evidence that a monkey died, or ape if you like, in Africa. Bottom line, though, one could argue that we've got plenty of bones that look like Chinese dragons, like these found in Dakota. There are exactly 0 mixtures of part human, part monkey. Now, there is certainly no shortage of drawings, and there are plenty of plastic Monkey Man museum displays. In layman's terms and intangible reality, there are millions and millions and millions of these, and there are definitely millions and millions and millions of these, but nowhere on the whole planet Earth do there seem to actually be any of these. And it's not for lack of looking. And the truth is that you would need enormous pockets of evolving primates. There should literally be billions of missing links. A Planet of the Apes world with evidence so easy to find that kids should find these things on their scouting trips, no matter where they are in the world. Just like they find seashells, giant clams in the Andes, the trilobites we find fossilized in mountains, which look strangely similar to the whelps of different types of trilobite-like creatures that we find crawling around on the bottom of the ocean right now today. What's sort of funny to me is that if I were to look into the camera and tell you that the swamp thing here was real, that would be science. But if I were to criticize it, even just a little, or possibly suggest, I don't know, that breeding monkeys doesn't pump out people, well, that would be religious. It actually reminds me of a quote by Napoleon, who one time stated, "Men will believe anything unless it's written in the Bible." I actually took a bit of an interest in some of the claimed missing links, particularly the ones that got pushed a little bit into the background. On the screen right here is a skeleton called Turkana Boy. This would be 5'6" individual. Now here's the fun part. This skeleton is believed to have belonged to a 9-year-old. Taking that a step further, I would be the first guy to wholeheartedly agree that there are wealths of strange things out there. Just none of them turn out to be monkeys evolving up into people. You know, there's a lot of very strange looking things, which sort of brings to mind the unusual skulls and skeletons found around massive temples in Peru. Though I had a different background put back there, this skull on the screen is not photoshopped. That so often appeared to be royal lineages, kingships, and princes surrounding megalithic pyramids and ritual blood sites for the worship of the dark gods, turning up all across the ancient Americas. Look at the massive scope on the back end of this one, recently found in Peru, or the humongous size of the mallet on this guy here, dropping down to this giant jaw. My, what enormous owl-looking eyes you have. My extremely strange large-headed friend. Yeah, I'm fairly certain that that doesn't happen by head binding. To the strange maze of very real madness, artifacts which at this point even include children. The genetic bloodlines pumping through the dark hearts of odd-looking royal families. A grand welcome to the circus. Absolutely sufficient for the colorful sideshow of any house of the deranged. And it's not just that the skulls fit together differently than a normal human skull seen here, with two parietal plates sutured or seamed together by this crease right here. And then on the elongated skull, it's not like that. It has one enormous skull cap. But if one were to zoom in on this particular guy, going a little deeper onto the front of the face, now would you consider that a fang right there when the tooth goes almost all the way up to the nasal cavity? Accordingly, a special thank you to my friend Brian Forrester in Peru, who recently had the opportunity to do genetic testing on these strange skulls. Reports which came back to read a few of the fragments I was able to sequence from this sample. 3A indicates that we are dealing with a new human-like creature, very distant from Homo sapiens, that's humans, Denisovans, that's humans as well, and Neanderthals. Now, what's really interesting is when you go from modern human skeletons, like the one seen back here, to more ancient human skeletons, like the Neanderthal seen on the screen, they not only genetically test human and the bone structures tit for tat, piece by piece, identical, but you're looking at an extremely heavy-duty skeleton in comparison to modern man. Not only do the teeth, which are all there, by the way, fit absolutely perfectly, but these teeth are not like your teeth. The teeth on this Neanderthal skeleton could last hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Your teeth can't do that. And it's more than just the brow ridge growth that you find on these skeletons, which is indicative of very long lifespans, or the fact that the actual cranial brain size of our ancestors certainly larger than ours today. But moving a step further, it's not just like the dragonfly that we are a diminished version of our forefathers, but the real smoking gun, or at least one of them, for these long lifespans actually comes not just from the orthodontics, not just from the skeletons, the facial, the brow growth, but from the juvenile Neanderthal skeletons. Just like today, you see puberty rates in children becoming shorter and shorter and shorter. What you're seeing in Neanderthal juveniles is that the development times for them to reach adulthood were extremely long. Noah and his sons could probably easily make a whole football team worth of linebackers intimidated, but the children that came directly following that flood. Neanderthal development in juveniles is extremely, extremely slow. This is 180 degrees, the opposite of primate or monkey development, which is nearly twice that of modern humans. These aren't monkeys. Not only are you looking at humans of extraordinary age when you are looking at Neanderthals, but more than that, a person 32 years of age or older might appear to be 16 by our modern standards. Dr. Jack Cuzo, paleontologist who did the first work working with Neanderthal children. But the truth is that none of this knowledge about Neanderthals and their slow development rates, or that these are super heavy-duty human skeletons with extremely long lifespans, is actually new. This is a recreation of what a Neanderthal child would actually very likely look like, done by the Anthropological Institute of Zurich. Now, there are those who state firmly that you would be crazy for even suggesting that there was a global flood, which is sort of strange to me because we're on a water planet. And what we're talking about here is a water catastrophe If we examine for a moment the topography of the Earth shown here, we see this enormous ridge that's at the bottom of the oceans. Let me ask you this. If there was originally a lot more continent on the planet Earth with volumes of underground pockets of water that are now what we call oceans, do you think that might be helpful in supporting enormous ecological systems? Almost forms, I don't know, the shape of the continents that are between it, sort of like a big zipper where something really enormous emerged out of. But lifting up from the mid-oceanic ridge like a fracture that seems to race underneath our current oceans, forming between itself the continents of all Earth and the surface of every one of those continents, almost as if they were squeezed upward, right in between, are covered with a mile to a mile and a half of strata. And those strata are made of sedimentary rocks, which actually is rocks laid down by water. More than that, within that strata, we not only find massive amounts of trees running vertical through the layers, like this one here, which means that the tree would have had to have been standing up while the layers of strata built up around it for hundreds of thousands of years. Going further, we find massive amounts of fish all around the whole globe, which are in the process of eating other fish like this one shown right here, or this nice looking fossil right here, or this one here. In truth, there's so many of these from all around the globe that you can buy them for to nothing. Or perhaps fossils like this one, literally animals swallowed up in sediments while in the process of giving live birth. Now, these strata of sedimentary deposits, that's rocks laid down by water, which cake the earth at a mile to a mile and a half, are often compared to tree rings. I guess my question would be this, because these aren't actually tree rings, are they? That's dirt, correct? Going one little step further, that mile and a half that cakes the entire earth of sedimentary strata or rocks laid down by water is not just chock full and teeming rich with marine life that died in trauma, including massive sea creatures that didn't have time to digest the food in their bellies. Herds of animals like this dinosaur graveyard in Canada, literally drowned and swallowed in earth, very often interwoven and tangled up with sea life. But those sedimentary layers of strata are sorted by weights and densities of sediments, sorted identically to what one would predict and expect if there were a lot of water pumping around on the surface of the ground. The geological column of these strata are commonly drawn like this, with different ages and eras. You'll find this often defined as a mental abstraction, which is putting it generously, because if we were accurately depicting the contents of those strata, it would be seashells and clams, seashells and clams, seashells and clams, seashells and clams, seashells and clams. It was Nicholas Steno, generally considered father of stratigraphy, wrote the book on stratigraphy, literally, of the axioms used right now by geologists today for strata, that these were deposits that were laid down by the global flood. It's a curious question to even ask how one would get the survivable strata, particularly sorted as it is, without there being a lot of pumping around on the surface of the ground. It's not made of moon dust. Our current method of dating fossils that we find within that strata is, well, doctor, how do you know that this is an old fossil? Well, that's quite simple, because it was in an old rock. But doctor, how do you know that it's an old rock? Because it contained an old fossil. But doctor, how are you certain that it's an old fossil? Well, I just told you, because it was in an old rock. This is about as scientific as asking your doctor, why is my cousin blind? And he replies, because he can't see anything. In fact, taking that just a pinch further, 99.99% of the fossils found within those sedimentary strata that cake the crust of the entire continents of the earth are vertebrae, marine life, seashells, clams, plankton, algae, and plants. The other 0.01% is where you begin your vertebrates, and most of those are fish. Phrased like that begins to sound an awful lot like a marine catastrophe, doesn't it? Strangely, though, the fact that Steno stated clearly, right on the cover of his book, no less, that all of these strata of sedimentary rock laid down by water, were laid down by the global flood, that part oddly doesn't seem to make it over to the modern textbooks. Probably just an oversight. Seem to be a lot. Now, if the oceans of this planet were not actually as deep as they are, and you were to flatten out the Earth, this whole planet would be roughly under 2 miles of water all across the globe. Though it was Antonio Pellegrini who in 1859 invented what they call plate tectonics. And plate tectonics, widely used and accepted right now today, was first developed by Pellegrini to put together what would amount to the first scientific global flood model. Fast forwarding in time to today, I feel indebted to Dr. Walt Brown, whose hydroplate theory not only takes you systematically through the explosive and cataclysmic formation of pretty much all of the major geological features of the planet Earth itself. You know, it's interesting that not only do the strata underneath the ground have no erosion between the layers, as one would expect if they were tens of thousands, hundreds, or dare I say millions of years old. But more than that, in so many wealths of places on the planet Earth, you find them all together as one piece, bent up as if at one point they were heated and compressed together like silly putty. And it's not just the bones of enormous creatures from the past that seem to have shrunk to today's sizes, but many of those mammoth creatures that are much smaller today, frozen in ice cubes, entire ecological systems, from 50 bison frozen while running to beavers, birds, and every between. This is the first of the frozen mammoths to have been pulled forth from the ice, currently housed in Petersburg, Russia. Not only did this creature not have time to fall over, but more than that, as if water had been squirting up so high and raining down as chunks of torrents of ice that systematically buried it in seconds. The animal died of suffocation, along with many bones in the back of the creature broken. And this little leggy here that is appearing to step forward has been pelted so many times with ice cubes that every bone in this little leggy here has been shattered. And the real fun part, when you're dealing with these enormous frozen creatures, they have tropical food in their mouths and tummies. And it goes deeper than our dragons buried underneath sediments in mass tangles of burial grounds. On the other side of the globe, in Mongolia, a Protoceratops and Velociraptor in mid-battle with each other, covered with sediments and earth so rapidly that not only did these creatures not have time to fall over, but they didn't even have time to look the other way. What's interesting about the boat's presumed landing point, which is probably not far from where it started from, as the boat really isn't designed to go anywhere. Well, there's nowhere to go, is that it's located a long way from the areas of intense underwater trauma, where the continents rise, causing, of course, the buckling effect that you see squeezed up all around the coastlines of the continents, and massive trauma of crinkling, which today goes by the name the Rocky Mountains. And in this area right here, where the boat presumably landed and took off from, one could assume that as opposed to massive smashes of walls of water, that you would see a rising of the abyss that would swallow everything, literally rocking the animals inside to sleep. If I start with large underground pools of water, if you were to get one little bitty crack run towards the surface, the water bursting forth, just like oil from an underground oil deposit, only with such force that the water literally shooting forth as high as space itself, coming out like a steamed vapor that would liquefy anything nearby as the crack widens with pressurized waters bursting forth, coming down as ice chunks, rain, and sediments. The crack following the path of least resistance, literally racing around the earth itself. A rupture in subterranean waters, which would squirt forth and create our later oceans, could certainly cause it to rain for 40 days and 40 nights. Sediments literally spilling forth, creating the fossil record. It's absolutely amazing that we're living in hours of history where you can actually look at it like a giant scar that ripped open and formed the oceans of all Earth. How about the Sahara Desert, the largest bald spot on the entire Earth, which some, interestingly enough, believe might have originally been the landmass where the Garden of Eden was. Whatever the case, this enormous desert here expands outward at a measurable rate. The Sahara Desert is between 4,500 and 5,000 years old. Now, if I'm correct, you can't get your desert until the water's gone. Is that still right? Now, if we were to delve back in to the Narmer Palette, right next to the Crow Falcon, coming straight across at eye level from the king, right about here on the Narmer Palette, right here, prominent on the palette of the first king of all of Egypt, directly under the first god of Egypt, we have the imagery of the boat. And the boat is, of course, being led by the falcon. The falcon was the animal that was let forth from the great vessel, or the raven, which was released from the great boat, according to the records of Assyrian and Sumerian kings. Records of the flood that covered the mountaintops. Going from King Narmer in ancient Egypt over to the much older King Gilgamesh of Sumeria, hopping from ancient Egypt and the land of the pyramids over to the place of the Tower of Babel in ancient Sumeria. It's important to note that in the Sumerian kings list, there's almost a difference between spiritual kingships and physical kingships. Gilgamesh often claimed to have been 18 feet tall, a human, or perhaps better stated, physical, biological, flesh and blood king, coming right after Enmerkar or Nimrod, who is one of the first kings following the flood in the Sumerian kings list. Gilgamesh is always recorded as a giant, seen in this statue with a lion in his arms, as if it were merely a pet house cat. The king, seen here, standing like a tower over the common peoples, literally whipping them into submission. But what really makes the king following Enmerkar or Nimrod of the oldest empire particularly, shall we say, special, is that on the 12 stone tablets of his epic, Gilgamesh claims that he is 2 parts man and 1 part God, with a lowercase g, almost as if to say that there was a mother, a father, and something else. It is my extremely strong opinion that the answers are very likely much larger, much deeper, and far more interesting than little men in spaceships visiting us from other planets. I think the scope, breadth, and depth is worthy of far more than that limited view. Nonetheless, if I hop from Gilgamesh in ancient Sumeria over to Egypt, it was the one who the Egyptians called Tem, the creation god, who was responsible for the primeval flood which covered the entire earth and destroyed all of mankind except those in Tem's boat. And hopping from Egypt on over to Assyria, Sumeria, where Gilgamesh, following Nimrod, was king over all earth. In the elements of the Assyrian-Sumerian account, it states, Utnapishtim was warned by the god E in a dream. He and some craftsmen built a large boat. He then loaded it with his family, the craftsmen, and the seed of all living creatures. Then the waters of the abyss rose up, and it stormed for 6 days. I find it particularly interesting that they went with 6 days for the time in which the flood rose. These top sections, or the pre-flood portions of the Sumerian Kings list, are believed by many to use a sexagesimal system with bases of 60 and an eerie amount of sixes in it. What really strikes me quickly is that there are a 6-digit on the hand wealth of ancient legends and drawings of the tall giants and people of the 6 fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's not just enormous axe heads like these seen at the museum in Heraklion, but The biblical giant, Goliath, shown here with the Philistine headwear, is also reported to have 6 fingers. There do seem to be an awful lot of very odd hands out there on stone. Have you ever noticed how you can tell the end of something by the very point where it begins? I think in a good story they call that foreshadowing. Though there are many similarities in the Hebrew text and the records on stone by your first little emerging cultures, the technical line by line precision in the Hebrew text is uncanny. I would have to agree with most scholars that the accounts, though containing similar elements, are literarily independent from each other, which is what one would anticipate to find if the records were independently talking about the same event. When thinking about the light year separator of precision found line by line in the pages of Genesis, it's important to bear in mind a record said to have been given to Moses, not sentence by sentence, but letter by letter, on the top of this charred black mountain here, Sinai, which is not in the official tourist location between the 2 fingers of the Red Sea, but is over here on this side, exactly where the biblical texts take you to. At this mountain, which is charred at the top, unlike any other surrounding it, like a sore thumb, sticking right up in the middle of the desert, called by the locals the Mountain of Moses, and surrounded by Jurassic Park style fencing and warning signs put up by the Saudi Arabian government. And of course, there, right down from the mountain, is the unusual rock that is split, that Moses is recorded to have hit with his staff, and it opened up, and the fresh waters came forth into the desert, literally pressure flaked, as would happen if water gushed forth out of it, and the stones leading out from either side are all smoothed exactly to what one would find under the bed of a river, in such stunning definition on the desert floor that you can actually see where the water was, right down at the base of Sinai, where you also find petroglyphs like these and all of the remains of the Hebrew settlement and camp, as well as the broken altar to the golden cow. The pages of Exodus read that they built that golden cow right down from where Moses got the 10 Commandments, where the glory and power of just a tiny part of God's presence rested like a fire on top of the mountain. After parting the Red Seas, you've got to imagine that even God himself was looking down and thinking, surely you can't be serious. But back in time, over here in Samaria, In the ancient records, the place where the falcon, the raven, or crow had become the favored bird to be released from the great boat, from the records of kings. In Assyrian Sumerian, it continues that the water covered all the mountains except where the boat landed. Upon seeing all the people killed, the gods, with a little g, wept. Utnapishtim released a dove, and it returned. And then a raven, which did not return. Nimrod in Merkur, displayed here with the mighty hunter's bow in his hand. Nimrod, or in Merkur in Sumerian, is king right before we find Gilgamesh, a warlord, coming right after the global flood in the Sumerian kings list, but greater than that, redundantly covered in all of the texts as having taken the power like a horse by the reins of all of those early settlements. The enormous star in the background behind him, and of course the symbol of the wings of the falcon raven extending from either side, or the deified by using the symbol of the raven's wings, imagery with the wings of Nimrod having the long beard, not dissimilar to what the Egyptologist Sir Flinders Petrie described the giant race as having. Artifacts from right up here in the biblical city of Nineveh, as in these two representations. You can see the deified and bearded Nimrod, builder of the great tower that went by the name Babel, holding the pine cone, or the dimensional symbol of the guidance of the third eye. On both of his wrists are these little symbols here, the lotus flower of reemergence, or more precisely, the symbol of the star. More specifically, the symbol of the one who is guiding both of his hands. And the representations of Nimrod can be drawn identically with the head of the raven, seen right here with the dimensional symbol of the third eye, and the interesting Philistine headwear. Artifacts from ancient Sumeria, which are stunningly identical to items found an ocean away in the pyramids of the Americas, where the pentacles of truly unusual biological artifacts are found. This one is from Ecuador. This one is Sumeria. It's not just the dimensional wisdom serpent that had slithered its way up into the new world. Aren't symbols, by their very definition, smaller representations of larger things? But indeed, the raven had flown its way from Sumeria, poking up to be branded in the Americas, which probably means that there were already plenty of people who had gone back and forth to the claimed New World long before Christopher Columbus. The first hint might have been that there were already people there when he discovered it. Flying back over to the land of the pyramids of ancient Egypt, the place where the raven or the falcon is coming right out the window of our boat. The iconic deification imagery for that bird, seen here on stone with the symbol of the star or the sun on its head, was used for two of the most important gods of all Egypt, Horus and Ra. There is a passage in Job 1, 6 through 7, which might be of use, where it says, the sons of God, B'nai Ha Elohim, came into the presence of Jehovah, and there did come also Satan, the adversary, in their midst. The falcon or the raven, like this serpentine Egyptian artifact here, or the somewhat angry looking bird of the air that Vishnu is commonly depicted riding over the waters on its wings, with the sun, symbol of the star, at his back. A small detail that often gets overlooked is that there are actually two birds in the Genesis text, a dove and a raven. Genesis 8:6 states, and he, Noah, sent forth a raven, which went forth to and fro until the waters were dried up from off the whole earth. Though they would go on to make little golden idols of that creature in places like Egypt, you've got to figure that Noah probably felt like that was a pretty worthless bird. Oh, it's not just that Noah is recorded as having literally released a raven which went to and fro up in the air without offering a pinch of aid or coming back to do anything useful for him. But a little deeper, could be asked what the dark bird that went to and fro in the air represents. Job continues, and the Lord said unto Satan, from where come you? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro in all the earth, lifting up from the murky mire of the bird that didn't care. We find the dove, a symbol which means not only power condensed into a package of sheer precision, but true power doesn't need to gloat. It doesn't have to. Now, in the Greek text, it was the Holy Spirit or the Helper which came down upon Jesus and rested upon Jesus like a dove. Is that correct? The dove represents love, peace, life, and most importantly, hope. What gets me immediately about the biblical records is that when anyone faces even the tiniest part of God Himself, there is this immediate feeling of inadequacy before the very maker of the particles of this place says, "Get up, my faithful son or daughter, welcome home." I guess in a very real way, we all choose the bird we follow. And for Noah, it was the dove, returning, as it were, the very hand of God Himself, with an olive branch of all things in its mouth. I'm going to lay it in your hands to decide what that little plant right there represents. Zooming in a little closer on ancient Samaria, the first settlements of all earth, we find the Sumerian tablet shown here of Lord Arata. Arata being a reference to the mountain of Ararat itself. And Lord Arata is very likely a pre-Tower of Babel Sumerian title for Noah himself. And in Merkar, a king who rose to power following the flood in the Sumerian kings list, or Nimrod in the biblical texts, builder of the Tower of Babel. Now bear in mind, this is written from the Sumerian perspective. According to Nimrod, or in Merkar in the text, Lord living up in the mountains was refusing to submit to Nimrod in Merkar. More specifically, Lord Arata, who they often said was very important and needed to be respected, was declining to pay tribute for the building of a few little bitty temple ziggurats, like this one seen at Ur, even refusing gifts from goddesses like the moon goddess Inanna, standing gloatfully with her foot on the back of a lion, or Semiramis. But more primarily, Lord Arata and the people that were living under him were refusing to contribute to the building of this ziggurat seen on the desert floor right here. A ziggurat located down here out of the modern mountains of Armenia, in precisely this spot, the high and lofty gateway of the Abzu, or ziggurat of Eridu, which was later mysteriously shaken to its base. In a paraphrasing of an Mordecai, Nimrod's document, he writes, Enki, the wise and knowing, Lord of the earth, shall bring forth the speech in their mouths. So the speech of mankind is truly one. One thing that hits me as particularly odd is that these intensely complicated early languages just sort of appear right in here with really no developmental history, as if right out of thin air. Sumerian would most certainly be a prime example of that. Taking the puzzles concerning languages a step deeper, when you're talking about Israel, the promised land that God guaranteed to Abraham, the languages to the west of Israel read left to right, while the languages on the east of Israel read right to left, as if pointing inward to something. Now, both Israel and Jesus are often symbolized by the olive tree. Isn't that right? Speaking of Abraham, it was in ancient Ur, right next door to the Tower of Babel, where it's written that Abraham was called by God himself out of the land of idols and rising towers to a land that God would show him. And Abraham, the father of all Israel, was in the bloodline, descent line, and lineage of Shem, one of the three sons of Noah. More specifically, Shem is the son for whom Noah himself placed the greatest crown of blessing onto. More specifically, this is the bloodline that would lead straight on through to the lion lying next to the lamb, the good shepherd over the sheep, perhaps the lion behind the lamb, Jesus Christ himself, the one for whom it is written, all, that's a big word right there, the families of the earth shall be blessed. Conversely, it's through the genealogy, bloodline, and lineage of Noah's son Ham that we find the fireworks show of true madness and rise of the great tower, the gateway to the Abzu, two separate paths that start in Genesis 20. And Noah planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine, and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father. And Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders, and went backwards to cover the nakedness of their father. And their faces were turned away, and they saw not their father's nakedness. And Noah awoke from his wine, and knew what his younger son had done unto him. And he, Noah, said, Cursed be Canaan, that's the son of Ham. A servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. And he, Noah, said, Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. Now I want to hit pause for just a moment on this dividing matter of Noah and his three sons, and this issue of nakedness, which had to be covered, taking us back from Noah all the way backwards over the flood, all the way to the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve. It's in that opening paradise, the first place where we find our dimensional serpent king from the abyss, like this small idol here. Whatever that tree was, I'm feeling it was much more than a standard apple, suggested to them by a serpent. Sometimes it only takes opening a door just a little for a lot of snakes to come through, and perhaps even larger and far more terrifying things to make their grand entrance. Ye shall be as gods. Genesis 3:5. That line hasn't stopped working. Almost like a carrot being tossed out there by somebody with a dimensional stick. What you bind on earth is bound in heaven. What you loose on earth is loosed in heaven. It's almost like something changed in that moment in paradise. And we can actually follow our serpent, slipping and slithering its way through all of the hours of coming history that survived the waters of the flood and emerged from the Abzu, making its way to the towering ritual temples, to the serpents, Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan in the Americas, some with little wiggly canals in the shape of serpents coming from altars, draining into basins so that the blood will form the shape of a snake while running off of the ancient stones, slipping all the way over, ocean away, to the serpents from the temples of Dendera in the lineage of Ramses the Great, all the way to the empires of the golden serpents, the royal serpents with many faces in ancient Asia, or the serpent god Vishnu of ancient India, seen here with the many faces of the serpent coming forth from the waters of the Abzu, who can also be drawn as the fish, not only popping up on the other side of the flood, but also the waters representing the Abzu, from which the slithery horned Capricorn goatfish lunging forth, not just from the other side of the flood as Poseidon, but from the watery depths of the abyss, the place where Vishnu himself sits resting on a bed of serpents over the Abzu or the Abuso, emerging forth from the depths of the deep, similar to the horned Norse god, pitchfork, trident in hand, just like the Philistine fish god, which takes us all the way back to Samaria, where this enormous wisdom serpent has brought these three fine gentlemen to their knees, or the original fish popping up from the abyss, Dagon himself. What's particularly interesting is that the fish god, like Vishnu, shown here, not only represents having made it to the other side of the flood from the depths of the abyss, but more than that was Dagon, who was worshipped right up here following the great river, coming right out of the water's edge on the massive Tigris in Nineveh. The remains seen here, where they not only worshipped the fish god, which had also become one with Nimrod, same pose as with the raven's head. It is interesting that to these worshippers of the man emerging from the fish, that a reluctant messenger of God himself would be delivered up, literally choked up, vomited out, and spit forth Jonah, the very man in the belly of the air-breathing fish for 3 days that had laid its head on their riverbanks. Jonah came forth from the belly of that fish after 3 days, just as Jesus Christ came forth from the belly of the tomb in 3 days. In fact, after the healing of the blind eyes, the causing the cripple to walk, and many, many other healings, when the Pharisees and the crowd were crying out for Jesus to perform a miracle, he said, "I give you nothing but the sign of Jonah." Though it's not pretty, there are actually quite a few reports throughout the ages of history of fishermen, particularly being cut out of the belly of large fish or whales while still alive. Whatever the case, it's almost as if the messenger was delivered up by deliberate design to bring the message in a way guaranteed to get their full, undivided attention. Bear in mind, they had been worshiping the fish god Dagon for roughly 2,000 years before Jonah showed up. And though these ancient gods may have many arms, many names, such as the elusive one, the destroyer, the trickster, and many faces, what's always conspicuously absent is the name love. Or our Enki slipping up from out of the Abzu here. If you take a look in just a tad closer, you can see the little fish in the dimensional symbol of these little wiggly lines on both sides. And at the top up here, we have our raven. And as the final touch, like a cherry on top, our tree of life, to be followed like a carrot on a stick by both Nimrod and then later Gilgamesh for all the days of their lives. Never trust the Enki. It doesn't seem to end well. It is my extremely strong opinion that if one were, shall we say, making phone calls through Pandora's box, it's a good idea never to get so excited that someone on the phone on the other end that you forget to ask, who am I really talking to? Now, those are serpents coming out of the Pharaoh's forehead, as if to symbolically represent the true power behind the empire of the king. In the very same spot where the third eye, or the mind's eye, would be placed, but spiraling our way back through the towers of our fish serpent, as if it had stamped itself in bright neon lights, its slithery signature wiggling like a raven with wings. Now, if I rewind backward just a touch more, going from the moment that Ham has entered Noah's tent and backwards to the other side of the waters, back in that garden, I found my first reference to nakedness. Noah's feeling of nakedness, just like Adam's feeling of nakedness. After they had fallen, and God, interestingly, enters the garden in the cool of the day and finds them hiding, covered with fig leaves. The last interaction recorded that God is going to have with Adam and Eve, the mother and father of all living. Genesis 3:21. The Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them, as if not only to cover their nakedness, which, just like the tree, probably means something larger in scope as well, but a step forward, like a lesson to both Adam and Eve, that for the covering of their sin, something innocent would have to lay down its life, as if it were a foreshadowing of an event to come. It would almost seem appropriate that those coverings for the nakedness would make it all the way through the 10 generations of bloodlines like a birthright from Adam to Noah. Only wonder if the picture may be somewhat larger than just seeing his father's nakedness in a drunk state, but perhaps an opportunity to come in and steal the very coverings. When Ham, father of the Canaanites, perhaps the old goat behind him, saw the nakedness of his father, handed down from Adam and Eve, to steal the very birthright, to slip in like the serpent from the Abzu and take by trickery the coverings that were given by God himself to Adam, perhaps leading to the reason why in the next passage Noah would literally issue the blessings and curses of the three sons, leading to two diametrically different paths. After all, a new thing had begun. The coverings, the symbolic trinket symbols through these generations were a thing of the past, perhaps a completion. One has to bear in mind that the biblical texts are not just precise line by line the more you investigate them, but they are dimensional in their scope. If you look at the root of the names in Genesis in order from Adam to Noah, it reads, man appointed mortal sorrow, the blessed God shall come down, teaching, his death shall bring the despairing rest and comfort. On one hand, the humble man who would begin a journey with God himself. On the other hand, we have the prideful man who would ultimately stand atop the very tower that would crumble beneath his feet while he arrogantly shook his fists upward at the Father of all life. The name Nimrod today commonly means idiot. It's come to my attention that God seems to be in the business of knocking down man's towers. The ziggurat of Eridu, shown here on the screen without any graphics or digital effects on it, would have been not only the oldest unified site and very likely the largest tower, temple, occult religious center, especially at that time, located just a hair this side of the Euphrates River, somehow shaken to its base. One can only imagine the sheer size against the horizon of that dot on the desert floor, in the pinnacle of its hour. I'd like you to notice on this particular artifact that Nimrod in Merkur, shown here, is not just leading the way up this spiral temple to the pinnacle with the star on top, but just like this small golden god idol here, or this image of a beast holding, as it were, its own child in its arms. He's got these little horns coming out the side of the head, not dissimilar to the helmets with horns worn by the Vikings in attempting to copy their Norse gods, such as the god Loki, the dimensional one of seduction, trickery, and delusions. But the remains of the entire religious center of the ziggurat of Eridu, otherwise known as the Tower of Babel, which could be viewed like an enormous summons, a really big Ouija board. Tower of Babel means gate of the god. That's God with most definitely a lowercase g. The place where, according to the Sumerian kings list, you have the global flood, and then right after the global flood, we find listed in Murkar or Nimrod and Gilgamesh, the place where it states on the tablet, after the flood, when the kingship from heaven was lowered, the kingship was in Eridu, which, though the stone from Eridu is talking about something that stepped up into reality at the Tower of Babel after the flood, in the book of Jude, when referencing a set of angels which entered prior to the flood, events that occurred in the pre-flood world, in Jude 6, it states, even the angels which kept not their first estate. Now, the word first estate has a dual meaning in that sentence. But left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. First estate, or the Greek okaterion, means that they had reduced their bodies from heavenly bodies, specifically meaning that wherever it is they were coming from, their bodies were greater than three-dimensional. Now, Christians commonly point out a passage found in Mark 12:25, where Jesus Christ himself says, "For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels." The key sentence is this: the angels which are in heaven. The fallen angels talked about in Jude specifically left heaven, but took even that a step further to do something that got them extra punished. To be even more precise about exactly what's being stated
Tim, go
in
to
the book
the
of
private
Enoch,
chat.
as well as the very first pages of the Torah, Genesis,
Private chat.
the book of Origin,
Private
and
chat.
many other, both texts and legends from across the earth, is that prior to that flood, a set of 200 fallen angels, led by 20 fallen angels, reduced themselves to make entrance and play lords and gods with mankind. And according to Enoch, the seventh from Adam, and the great grandfather of Noah. These fallen angels made entrance during the days of Enoch's father, Jared, on the top of a mountain called Hermon. Now, it was the Greeks who, in truth, copying from the Egyptians, firmly believed that their gods entered from the top of Mount Olympus, such as Prometheus, seen in this statue here, sort of a floaty little one, isn't he? No wings either. Not dissimilar to the artistic madness, like this man here, being ripped up and yanked into the air. Now, the gods would swoop down from Olympus to mate with the women and alter the state of mankind, which is, of course, what the idea behind Prometheus actually means. And this produced a variety of unnatural things. The events recorded of Gilgamesh, Nimrod, and the Tower of Babel come after the flood, whereas the Greek legend of Olympus represents a time period prior to the flood. Most notably, the Titans coming down from the Greek gods, like this part man, part god giant displayed here in enormous size as compared to the common man, as in this post-flood Sumerian Babylonian depiction of the three men bringing the star of Ishtar before the king. Thinking about pre-flood worlds, it was the Greek legend of Atlantis. Though the idea of Atlantis is commonly presented as a sunken city, of which there are many sunken cities around the globe, some of them from the settling in of the earth following the flood. The idea of Atlantis perhaps is something a little larger than that. The place of the great tower of otherworldly wisdom, a literal hub of advancement. And it's said that not only were things much larger in scope in Atlantis, but animals mixed with animals, plants genetically mixed with other plants, and of course, Atlantis was hydroponic with large pockets of water underneath the earth and sustaining the ecological systems on top of the ground. Advanced technology that altered everything. Taught by the gods, an empire often said to have had the heights of biological strangeness, which ultimately was swallowed up by the waters. So I guess in a very real way, the death of their world is what's lighting yours. Now, Enoch, a text that actually would have been on that ship, is recording the teachings of those fallen angels prior to that flood. Teachings which included the smiting of the human baby in the womb. The women were taught the arts of seduction. Of course, the men wore, and as a nice little touch, the value of the precious minerals, i.e., illusionary systems of trade, the financial systems. Going a step deeper than the trinkets they were handing to mankind, what the angels appeared to be particularly interested in was not just the teachings of witchcraft and summoning of demons, but they were highly interested in the signs of the earth, signs of the clouds, etc. But more specifically, there were more than 4 angels who were very interested in the signs of the stars, almost like rebellious servants keeping track of what the master of the house is doing. Now, God said that the stars in the sky are at least there for signs, like his billboard, which is probably why when a little bitty flesh and blood man named Enoch, with a message from God himself, walked into their midst, he had their full, undivided attention. And a part of that message is, though you thought you had secrets, little did you know you only had the worthless ones. Indeed, even angels and the darkest things that dwell in the abyss can scream. Does God not say, I use the weak things to bind the strong, and the foolish things to confound the wise? It's also come to my attention that God seems to really favor the humble, diligent man over the rising empires of the prideful. Speaking of stars, though the teachings of fallen angels would be what we would call astrology, or applying the fortune telling to your personal life, in terms of God's billboard, it does seem like pretty well everyone in the ancient world understood the signs of the zodiac, which tell the biblical story, beginning, of course, with Virgo, the virgin, coming around full circle to end with Leo, the lion. Nimrod seemed to understand it so well that we find depictions of the mighty hunter against God, Nimrod, with his bow in hand and intricately drawn lions all over Nineveh, not just killed, but absolutely over and redundantly killed. Many with Nimrod having the lion brought to him by his men so that he can literally drive in the death blow by his own hand with his own blade, as a grand statement to God himself by Nimrod, his belief that he was mightier than the coming lion. Going from Nimrod to Gilgamesh, we find this strange character named Indinku that just sort of pops up into Gilgamesh's life. The two would end up going on a journey together. And Indinku, shown here with the little bitty horns on his head, seemed to have a real taste for the temple prostitutes. Though the text reads that the two had become close friends, the intimacy there is almost like, I don't know, father and son. Nonetheless, it is right after the flood in the Sumerian Kings list that it is written of Gilgamesh that "26 years." Now, when they say panspermia, one has to wonder exactly what it means. Now, Pan was the horned Greek god, correct? It is rather strange that these gods need an invitation, even when playing shadow people and little alien genetic collecting games. Almost as if not only do you have authorities and things that it wants, but more than that, like it's terrified that you would see behind the mask and look at it as it is. No matter the case, whatever it was that re-entered following that flood would be covered and crawl its way to be worshipped in some form or another in every culture. Legends not just including strange arrays of biological oddities and the realms from which Loki might emerge, but also the symbolism of the star can also be drawn as the swastika. Now, it's important to point out that stars like this one on top of the Ziggurat of Eridu next to Nimrod at the top of the Tower of Babel, stars in all of ancient texts are extremely often symbolic representations of angels. Very powerful dimensional beings. B'nai Ha Elohim, the watchers, perhaps in this case, a very specific fallen angel. And that star at the top of the temple could be depicted in a Babylonian or Sumerian crescent or moon. The moon representing the feminine, which the star has rested inside of, the incubus and the succubus, And of course, the crescent moon takes us all the way back to our original moon goddess, the wife of Nimrod, Semramses, or Semiramis, seen here between the two twisting serpents, which is one and the same as Ishtar, the Sumerian winged goddess, seen here with the little wide-eyed owls of the moonlight as the guardians, standing by her bird-shaped feet, absolutely identical to all of the other claimed goddesses of the crescent. Astarte, Asheroth, Queen of Heaven, Diana, or the triple moons with the star in the center. Wondering if I could take a guess what this little symbol here might mean. Let's see, I've got 3 moons and a star in the center. Semramses, Nimrod, and the part god, part man offspring, Tammuz, which is the same exact thing as saying in Mordor and Nana, the temple moon goddess, and Gilgamesh, God King, Star, Moon Goddess, or the 3 stars, the remnants of the top one, which can still be seen on this commemorative tablet. And this is a statue of the deified Tammuz sitting on his throne, as is seen in a display in Hungary. Wait just a second, because this unholy trinity from right here between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Fertile Crescent, the cradle of all civilization, where little tiny settlements would begin to sprout up, reaching all the way down even to Egypt. Strangely, our anomalies must come in pairs, because if I were to go from the Tower of Babel and Ziggurat of Eridu and hop right over here to Egypt at the inception of the land of the pyramids and the Eye of Horus, you would find another trinity. Isis, our winged Egyptian moon goddess with the crescent right on top of her head. Osiris. Osiris is the legendary founder of all Egypt, shown here with the little horns coming off of his head, a representation perhaps of the horns of the god he's allowing to operate through him. Hathor, seen right here at the very top of the Narmer palette. And of course, the part god, part man offspring, described as Horus. And Horus, of course, is depicted as the dimensional eye atop the pyramid that is peering in and watching. From the Egyptian Nu, place of chaos, the abyss, places of the deep. And since we've got triple moons here, let's see if we can't go 3 for 3, because one could almost think that this triad, the founders behind all of the dark occult beliefs of all Egypt, as well as this triad of the goat seeming to emerge through the man. In the ancient accounts, descriptions, and events, we're talking about the same triad of people in different tongues, as if it were a first little seed of something beginning to spread up right about here in Eridu, coincidentally. Same place where you find the ziggurat of Babel itself, the beginning, or perhaps re-beginning. That is the precise point where you see the rise of all Earth's coming empires. Now, though it was Enoch who was not, for God took him, it was Noah's grandfather, Methuselah, whose name means his death shall bring, or perhaps his death shall bring the judgment. The longest living man in the biblical text at 969 years, who died the very year or 7 days before that flood. But back in that garden, on the other side of the flood, when Eve was confronted by the serpent, she was conspicuously alone. Adam was about to have to make the hardest choice of his entire life. On one hand, he had Eve. On the other hand, he had everything. Adam would have viewed Eve just as he would a part of himself. It says in the text that Eve was deceived, but that Adam knew what he was doing. I would argue that as Adam bit into that fruit, he did not do it in defiance to God, but he did it out of love for Eve. He was willing to lay down everything for his bride and step into death itself. Though sin, darkness, and decay entered through Adam, it was truly only covered and paid for by the Lamb that would be slain. What Adam could have never done for Eve, God himself did for all mankind. And the truth is, we're all tainted in this place, just like Eve was, perhaps bringing deeper meaning to the words covered by the blood. Even if you've got 6 fingers and are 9 feet tall. Act 1 of mankind began with a tree, and it ended with a tree. The wild vine shall be grafted to the branch, though things that dwell in the shadows, like the little bitty inky, may have lots of words and be desperate to talk to anyone who will listen. It takes a true kind of love for one to lay down their life for their friends. You and I are living in the greatest love story ever told. Perhaps that's why they call it history. His story. And you're living a part of that. Now it says in the text that the boat rested on top of the mountain in the 7th month on the 17th day of the month, which is really fascinating because Jesus was crucified in the 7th month, or the month of Nisan, on the 14th day of the month. If you add 3 days to that, you're at the 17th of Nisan, when the tomb door was rolled away and Jesus Christ stepped forth from that tomb, and a new thing had begun. Noah's Ark resting on top of the mountain is the anniversary in advance of the day that Jesus Christ would step out the door of that tomb, buried right into the text itself. After the flood, the first thing that Noah thought to do was plant a beautiful vineyard. Mount Ararat today is a mountain sticking up like a sore thumb, covered with ice, 75 square miles worth, much of it hundreds of feet thick. Just like God to possibly protect the boat that saved all mankind, the most astounding artifact that would ever be discovered on all earth, buried like a mammoth waiting to be found. And though many of the locals at the base of that mountain say they don't know why, the area is called the Land of the Eight. And I bet you'll never guess what grows wildly right at the base of that mountain. Vineyards. Amazing vineyards. Home of the oldest wineries on earth, with Ararat right here in the background. That is a narrow door, isn't it? Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh before the Father except by me. Indeed, all creation awaits the hours of its restoration, the entrance of the Good Shepherd, the coming of the bridegroom, the Adam that didn't fail, the return of the King. No matter who you are on the other side of this screen, I pray that God Himself lead you and lift you as an eagle with wings on your quest. The truth is, a video like this one barely even scratches the surface of the mysteries embedded in that text. A self-authenticating message from outside the confines of time, matter, and space itself. Did I mention that it's generally how a story begins that determines everything about the fireworks show of how it ends? After all, lifting up the veil on this present illusion to peek in at the ending is where it really gets interesting. Guess we'll have to do that next time. Thank you for watching Noah by the God in a Nutshell Project. I'm Trey Smith.